Michael Caine hadn't heard a single voice raised inside his walls in 11 years. In the Caine mansion on Beacon Hill, silence wasn't a preference, it was a law, the kind of law that men had bled to enforce. His guards spoke in whispers. His enemies didn't speak at all. So when he stepped through the front door at 7 in the morning, his knuckles still raw from the night's work down at the harbor, and heard someone singing, he stopped as if he'd walked into a wall. It was off-key, cheerful, utterly fearless. In the marble hall where powerful men had trembled, a young woman was kneeling by the coffee table, a dust cloth in one hand, earbuds in, humming an old love song like she owned the place. Like she didn't have the faintest idea she was cleaning the home of the most feared man in Boston. She was just a young woman, barely stepping into adulthood. Her dark hair was pulled up in a bun that had already lost the fight, loose strands falling across a face that was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the morning. Her sweater was 2 sizes too big, worn thin at the elbows. There was a bruise of exhaustion under her eyes that a girl her age shouldn't have earned yet, and still she was singing, swaying a little, wiping down a table worth more than she'd make in a year, as though joy were something she wouldn't let anyone take from her. Behind Michael, his men froze in the doorway. Not one of them dared breathe. They knew what happened to strangers who wandered into this house uninvited. They waited for the order, the cold nod, the quiet word that ended things. It didn't come. Because Michael Caine, a man who hadn't felt anything in longer than he could remember, stood there watching a poor girl scrub his floor and sing to an empty room, and something inside his chest cracked in a place he'd thought had died years ago. Her name was Grace Bennett, and she wasn't supposed to be here. Her mother, Rosa, had cleaned these halls for years, silent and invisible, exactly the way Michael liked it until a stroke put Rosa in a hospital bed and left a mountain of medical bills no waitress salary could ever climb. Grace had a little brother at home, 9 years old, with a heart that was failing and a surgery the family couldn't afford. She didn't know who Michael Caine really was. She didn't know about the harbor, or the men who disappeared, or the empire built on fear that ran straight through the marble beneath her knees. All she knew was that this job was the only thing standing between her brother and a grave, so she'd put on her mother's uniform, walked into the lion's den, and started to sing. What she couldn't have known was that her voice had just reached into the coldest man in the city and turned a key that had rusted shut. And what neither of them could have known was that the moment the boss decided to let her stay, he'd painted a target on both their backs because there were people watching that house. People with plans, and a poor girl with a song was about to become the most dangerous complication in Michael Caine's ruthless, guarded, lonely world. If this story already has your heart, do me a favor and hit that like button right now. Share it with someone who believes people can still change. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Now let's get back to the morning it all began, and the singing that changed everything. The very moment their eyes met, the small world Grace had built, with her song shattered like thin glass. She yanked the earbud from her ear, the music still whispering faintly in the hollow of her palm, and the dust cloth slipped from her trembling fingers and fell onto the marble floor without a sound. She sprang to her feet so quickly that her knee struck the edge of the coffee table. Pain flashed sharp and sudden, but she didn't dare cry out. She only stood rigidly, like a child caught doing something forbidden. In front of her was a tall man in a dark coat, standing motionless in the entryway, and what sent a chill down Grace's spine wasn't his appearance, but the way he looked at her, not with heat, not with shouting, only quietly and deeply, like a frozen surface of water hiding an abyss beneath it. "Mr. Caine," she stammered, her voice stumbling up through a throat gone dry. "I'm sorry, I'm truly sorry. I didn't hear you come home. I shouldn't have turned on music. I shouldn't have been singing. I know it's supposed to be quiet here. My mother told me over and over, and I still forgot." The apologies spilled out of her without control, piling one on top of another, and as she spoke, she bent to pick up the fallen cloth, her other hand unconsciously smoothing the hem of her mother's loose uniform, as though making herself a little neater might somehow make amends. "I'm Grace," she went on, trying to lower her voice into something calmer, though it did her no good at all. "Grace Bennett, Rosa's daughter, the woman who cleans for you." She swallowed, her eyes flicking quickly toward the men standing silent at the threshold behind him, their faces cold and blank, making her stomach tighten. But even that vague fear wasn't as large as the true fear screaming inside her head, that if this man threw her out right now, the only job keeping her entire family from sinking would vanish, and that was something she couldn't allow to happen at any cost. She didn't think at all about the fact that she was standing alone in a strange room with a man her instincts told her she should stay far away from. She didn't think about his hands, about the red scrapes still marked across his knuckles that she had accidentally glimpsed. All her mind could cling to was the image of the end-of-the-month pay envelope and the numbers she had counted over and over in the night 100 times. Michael still hadn't said a word. He slowly set the leather briefcase down on the console table near the door, removed his coat with a slowness that was almost cruel, and throughout all that time his gaze didn't leave her for even a second. His silence was more frightening than any scolding could have been, because Grace had no way to read it. She didn't know whether it warned of rage or of an indifference even worse than that. She kept talking, because silence now felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. My mother has always worked here very carefully. She values this job so much, and I'll do it exactly the way she does. I promise I won't cause you any trouble. I just need— She stopped, biting her lip, trying to swallow down the part of the sentence that had nearly exposed a private desperation she didn't want anyone to see. I just need to keep working, that's all. For an instant, she thought she heard one of the men behind him shift slightly, as though waiting for a signal, and the thought that one nod from the man in front of her would be enough to decide her fate made her hands clench the cleaning cloth so tightly her knuckles went white. Michael took one step forward, his leather shoes striking the marble floor with a dry, clean sound, and Grace instinctively stepped back half a pace, her back nearly touching the edge of the table. He stopped, lowered his head to look at the mop bucket beside her feet, then at the gleaming streaks she had just wiped across the fine wood table, and at last for the first time he spoke, his voice so low and even it almost weightless. "Where is your mother?" Those 3 words alone made Grace flinch as though someone had touched a wound, and she answered in a rush. "My mother suffered a sudden stroke. She can't come to work for a while, so I came in her place. Please don't fire her. It wasn't my mother's fault." She said it so quickly and so earnestly that even she was startled by her own recklessness, because she had just begged a man she knew nothing about for something that probably meant nothing to him, but to her was everything. Michael didn't answer at once. He looked at her for a long while longer, his gaze passing over her pale, frightened face, over her thin shoulders trembling beneath the oversized uniform, over the way she stood with half her body in front of the mop bucket, as if protecting the humble work itself. And in that instant something moved through his dark eyes that she couldn't name, something almost like curiosity, almost like confusion, as though he were looking at a misplaced creature that had wandered into a world where it never should have belonged. "People don't sing in this house," he said at last, slowly, one word at a time, and Grace lowered her head. "Yes, I understand. I won't do it again." But even as she made that promise, some very small, very stubborn part inside her chest already knew it was a promise she wasn't sure she could keep, because for Grace Bennett, singing had never been only singing. It was the only thing left that helped her stand upright through every morning. And right now, standing in that cold room beneath the gaze of that frightening stranger, she needed it more than ever. The man at the head of the bodyguards behind him stepped forward, and the way he moved, cleanly, deliberately, without a single wasted motion, was enough for Grace to understand that he wasn't the kind of man accustomed to hesitation. He was Frank Doyle, though at that moment she didn't know his name. All she saw was a face that looked to be in its 40s, with eyes as sharp as a scalpel, and he didn't bother to look at her even once. He only spoke to Michael in a low voice, just loud enough for the whole room to hear. "She can't stay here." Frank walked around Grace as if she were a piece of furniture set in the wrong place, took his position opposite Michael, and continued with a calm that was even more frightening than anger. "We know nothing about her except a name and an unverified story. How long was she in the house before you came back? Which rooms did she pass through? What did she see? We don't know." He paused for a beat, his eyes sliding over the mop bucket, over the stack of cleaning cloths, over the phone still playing music until Grace hurriedly turned it off, and then he went on. "Rosa is different. Rosa has been thoroughly checked for years. We know where she sleeps, where she eats, what her children are like. But this girl only appeared this morning, and you're going to let a stranger move freely through a house that contains things that could get a dozen people killed if they ever got out. Grace stood rooted between the two men, feeling like a rabbit trapped between two wolves. And she wanted to speak, wanted to say that she hadn't seen anything, hadn't touched anything. But her throat had gone dry and stiff, and she understood that anything she said now would only make everything worse. So she simply stood there, her hands clenched together, trying to make herself as small as possible. Frank still hadn't stopped, and every word he spoke was so coldly reasonable that Grace couldn't argue against it, even as she trembled inside with desperation. All it takes is one phone call from her to the right person, one hurried photograph, then everything you've built over all these years comes down. You know that better than anyone. We can't take risks because of pity. Pity is a luxury people like us aren't allowed to have. That final sentence hung in the cold air of the room, and Grace felt her heart sink, because she knew he was right. She knew that by every ordinary logic, she should be taken out through that door at once, and the thought made her eyes sting, though she clenched her teeth and refused to let the tears fall. Through all that time, Michael said nothing. He had finished taking off his coat, folding it, and laying it over the back of a chair with such slow care that it was as though the argument over a human being's fate taking place beside him carried no weight at all. Then he stepped toward the coffee table Grace had just cleaned, dragged one finger lightly across the gleaming wood surface, checking something whose meaning only he understood. Frank waited, and the men at the threshold waited, and Grace waited with her heart pounding, so hard she thought everyone could hear it. At last, Michael straightened, turned back to Frank, and spoke in that low, even voice Grace was beginning to recognize as his most dangerous sign. She stays. Only 2 words, but they fell into the room like a stone dropped onto the surface of a still lake, and Grace saw Frank go rigid, saw the men behind him exchange baffled looks, because clearly this wasn't what any of them had expected. Frank didn't back down right away. He lowered his voice another notch, almost to a whisper. "Are you sure? One mistake is all it takes." Michael cut him off with a single look, no raised voice, no threat, only a look, but it was enough to make Frank close his mouth and step back exactly 1 pace, lowering his head slightly in a gesture of reluctant obedience that Grace recognized as the farthest a man like him could go in showing disagreement. Michael didn't explain. That was what made even Grace, in the middle of her dizzying relief, feel that something was strange, because he gave no reason at all. He didn't mention Rosa. He didn't appeal to the pity Frank had just dismissed. He didn't say a single word to justify the decision that had just stunned every experienced, watchful man in that room. He only turned to her, his eyes dark and unreadable, and said, "You'll work the way your mother worked. On time, in the proper rooms, nowhere beyond the places you're allowed to go, and you will never," he pressed lightly on the word never, "ask anything about things that have nothing to do with cleaning." Grace nodded again and again. "Yes, I understand, I promise," even though 1,000 questions were spinning through her mind, questions she knew she would never be allowed to speak aloud. Michael looked at her for 1 more second, then turned and walked toward the hallway, leading deeper into the house, and just before he disappeared around the bend, Grace heard Frank speak after him, so softly it was almost meant for Michael alone. "One day you'll pay for this softness." And she saw Michael stop for half a beat without turning his head, then continue walking as though he hadn't heard a thing, leaving Grace standing in the marble room with the mop bucket at her feet, unable to understand why she had just been allowed to stay, and even less able to understand why that seemed to frighten everyone in this house so much. In the days that followed, Grace learned that this house operated according to an unwritten set of laws no one bothered to set down for her, and she had to feel her way through each one by herself, most often by making a mistake, and then enduring warning looks in return. The first lesson was about the doors. There were 3 rooms on the ground floor that were always locked tight, and one time, when she accidentally placed her hand on the doorknob of the room at the end of the east hallway, only intending to wipe away the faint layer of dust on it, a man she had never seen before appeared from somewhere so quickly that she almost screamed. He only gave a slight shake of his head, not saying a word, and Grace pulled her hand back as though she had touched a hot stove, murmured an apology, and hurried away with her heart beating wildly. The second lesson was about those people. They were everywhere, standing in corners she never expected, one by the tall window looking out over the garden, one at the foot of the staircase, one leaning against the wall near the kitchen with his arms folded across his chest, and all of them had the same way of looking at her, not exactly hostile, but watchful, the look of men whose job was to remember every movement she made, and Grace quickly understood that even though no one said it aloud, she was being watched every minute. The third lesson, and the one that made her shiver the most when she discovered it, was the cameras. They were small, discreet, hidden in places an ordinary cleaner would never think to notice, on a high wall ledge, behind the frame of a painting, in the corner of the kitchen ceiling, and one morning, when the slanting sunlight flashed across the glass eye of one of them, Grace suddenly realized that from the second she crossed the threshold until the moment she left, not one moment of hers was truly private. She wasn't naive. She didn't tell herself this was only the home of an eccentric rich man, because ordinary rich people didn't need an entire army standing guard in the living room, didn't keep nameless rooms locked tight, didn't install cameras to keep watch over the woman who mopped the floors, and the clear-headed, cautious part of her, the part that had learned how to survive through hard years, knew very well that this place was hiding things, and the less she knew about them, the safer she would be. But she needed this job, needed it so badly that every morning when she woke, the numbers of her debts appeared in her mind before she even had time to open her eyes. And so she swallowed every question, lowered her head, worked, wiped every surface until it shone, and tried to become invisible exactly the way people expected her to be. The problem was that Grace had never been good at becoming invisible. Her nature was hard to put out, and although she had promised not to sing, sometimes a melody still slipped softly from her lips before she could hold it back. And at those moments she would startle, glance around to see whether anyone had heard, and fall silent with the expression of someone who had just committed a crime. Then there was her mouth too, that habit of saying what she thought before she had time to weigh it. One afternoon, while she was cleaning the large mirror hanging in the living room, one of the men, a younger one than the others, with a face that was a little less cold, was standing nearby, and Grace, after days of silence so suffocating she could hardly bear it, couldn't stop herself from blurting out, "I don't understand how a house this beautiful can be so sad. I mean, everything is gray. The walls are gray, the curtains are gray, even the air in here is gray. It's like someone deliberately drained all the color out of it. This place is missing light, missing green plants, missing," she stopped, searching for the word, "missing life." The young man looked at her with a mixture of surprise and an expression that suggested he was trying not to laugh. He glanced quickly toward the hallway, as if to make sure no one else had heard, then said quietly, "You should be careful with that mouth of yours. People here aren't used to hearing comments like that." Grace flushed, hurriedly said yes, and turned back to the mirror, wiping it twice as fast, as though diligence could erase what she had let slip. But even as she lowered her head and scrubbed every cloudy streak from the glass, she still couldn't extinguish the stubborn thought that she was right, that this house was more like a mausoleum than a home, beautiful and cold and deathly, and that the man who lived inside it must be terribly lonely and endure that emptiness day after day. She didn't know that above her head, behind one of the tiny camera lenses she had learned to ignore, someone was silently watching, and she couldn't possibly imagine that the clumsy remark that had just slipped from her lips, the kind of thing anyone else in this house would have been wise enough never to say aloud, had been heard in full by the man sitting alone in a dark room upstairs, and that he remained seated before the screen for a long time after she had walked out of the frame, staring into the empty space where she had just stood, with an expression none of his men could have deciphered. It happened on a cold, rainy noon, when Grace passed by the vast kitchen, all stainless steel and cold stone, and caught the young man to whom she had accidentally spoken too freely the other day, standing there rummaging through the refrigerator, with the expression of someone starving, but unable to find anything worth eating. When she glanced inside, she saw exactly what she had guessed she would see: a few expensive bottles of liquor lying at odd angles, several boxes of takeout that had gone cold and begun to smell, a jar of olives, and nothing that resembled a real meal at all. She asked him whether he had eaten anything since morning, and he shrugged and said nobody cooked here. People either ordered food in or went without. And for some reason that careless answer made something inside Grace ache. That part of her that was used to taking care of others, used to turning cheap ingredients into something warm for hungry stomachs. Before she had time to think about the consequences, she had rolled up her sleeves, searched through the cabinets until she found some pasta, a can of tomatoes, onions, garlic, and a few forgotten spices pushed far back into the corner of a shelf, and she began to cook, not because anyone had told her to, but simply because she couldn't stand there and watch people go hungry when her hands knew how to feed them. Before long, that cold kitchen was filled with something it had never known before: the fragrant smell of onions sizzling in oil, the scent of tomatoes thickening into sauce on the stove, warmth rising from the pot of boiling water, and that aroma spread out of the kitchen, slipping along the gray hallways, seeping into the cold rooms like something alive, slowly reclaiming a place that had been dead for a long time. The young man watched her cook with an expression half doubtful, half eager. Then a second man appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the smell of food, then a third, and before long, 4 or 5 large men who were usually cold and silent were standing around the kitchen counter, and when Grace spooned steaming portions of pasta onto plates and pushed them toward them, she saw something strange happen on those hard faces, a loosening, a trace of hesitation, almost like embarrassment, as though it had been far too long since anyone had done something kind for them, without demanding anything in return. They ate, cautiously at first, and then ravenously, and someone muttered a compliment that sounded as if it had been forced out of his mouth, and Grace smiled, feeling for the first time since she had stepped into this house that she was useful in a way she understood. She was about to serve the young man another helping, when the whole kitchen suddenly went silent. Michael was standing in the doorway. No one had heard him arrive, and for one breathless, stretched-out moment, the men froze with plates of food in their hands, their eyes dropping to the floor, the entire room seeming to hold its breath while it waited for the storm to break, because they knew the rules. They knew this woman was never supposed to turn the Kingpin's kitchen into a family diner, and they braced themselves for the cold reprimand that was surely coming. Grace turned around, still holding the ladle, and met Michael's eyes, and she opened her mouth to apologize, to explain that she had only seen they were hungry. But before the words could come out, she stopped, because something in the way he was looking left her unable to speak. He wasn't looking at his men. He was looking at the pot on the stove, at the thin steam still rising from it, and for one very brief instant, so brief that Grace almost thought she had imagined it, something passed over his cold face, something old and distant, like a memory awakened against his will. He stepped into the kitchen, and the men hurriedly moved aside, but he said nothing to them. He only came closer to the counter, looked down at the plate of food that remained, then lifted his eyes to Grace. She swallowed, gathered all her courage, spooned a portion onto a plate, and pushed it gently toward him, her voice soft. "You should eat a little too. It's so cold today." The entire room seemed to stop breathing again, because no one, absolutely no one, had ever dared tell Michael Caine what to do in his own house. Michael looked at the plate of food for a long while. Then, to the stunned silence of every man in the kitchen, he pulled out a chair, sat down, picked up the fork, and ate. He ate slowly, quietly, without a single comment, but Grace, standing close enough to see, noticed his hand pause for a moment after the first bite. She noticed something in his shoulders, always held tight, soften even if only a little, as though the taste of this simple hot meal had touched a place in him that he had locked away a very long time ago. No one dared say a word. The men finished their food in reverent silence, stealing occasional glances at their boss, with the expressions of men witnessing something impossible, and, when Michael was finished, he set down his fork, rose to his feet, and for a moment Grace thought he would leave without saying anything, but he stopped just before walking out of the kitchen, without turning his head, and said in that familiar low, even voice, "This time, clean the kitchen well enough that the smell is gone before you leave." Then he disappeared, leaving behind a kitchen still warm with the breath of food, and a group of bewildered men who didn't understand that they had just witnessed the first crack in a block of ice they had all believed would never melt. It happened a few days later, when Grace was assigned to clean Michael's study, one of the few rooms she was allowed to enter, and only when he was away from the house. It was a stern room, with dark wooden bookshelves and a large desk, and as Grace cleaned, she was careful not to move anything from its place, because she had learned that, in this house, order wasn't a habit but a kind of law. When she pulled open the top drawer of the desk to wipe away the thin layer of dust along the wood, her hand stopped in midair. Lying neatly inside the drawer, beside a stack of papers and an expensive fountain pen, was a black handgun, its cold metal gleaming under the light, and beside it were bundles of cash tied neatly with paper bands. More money than Grace had ever seen with her own eyes in her entire life. She stood frozen, the cleaning cloth suspended in her hand, and in that moment her heart slowed, then began to pound, because although she had suspected it for a long time, although the cautious part of her had been whispering for days that this place wasn't normal, seeing that cold proof with her own eyes was an entirely different blow. She thought of the men posted throughout the house, the locked rooms, the cameras hidden in the dark, Michael's scraped red knuckles on that first morning, and all the separate pieces she had deliberately refused to fit together suddenly locked into place and formed a picture she wished she had never seen. She didn't know exactly who Michael Caine was. She didn't know how heavily his name weighed in worlds she had never touched. But she knew enough to understand that this man was dangerous, that this house was built on things people had to kill to protect, and that she, Grace Bennett, a poor girl in a worn sweater with a stack of bills she couldn't pay, had walked herself into the very heart of something far beyond anything she could imagine. Her first instinct was to run. There was a voice in her head, the voice of reason, of survival, screaming that she should close this drawer very softly, take off her mother's uniform, walk out that door, and never come back, that no paycheck was worth getting involved with people who kept guns and nameless bundles of cash in desk drawers. But then, standing there with both hands trembling, Grace thought of something else, a small face waiting for her at home, a fragile little life whose every difficult breath was a reminder that time was not on their side, that the hospital did not wait for courage or righteousness, only for money, and that this job, however frightening it was the only rope still keeping her whole family from falling into the abyss. And so the tearing struggle began, a silent war taking place right there in that cold study, between the rightful fear urging her to flee and the love and desperation holding her feet in place. Grace understood exactly what she was choosing. She wasn't some naive girl fooling herself into believing that the things in this drawer had a harmless explanation. She knew what they were, knew what they meant, and it was precisely because she knew that the decision she was about to make felt so heavy. At last, after a silence so long she could hear her own heartbeat clearly, Grace slowly pushed the drawer shut, carefully and gently, leaving everything exactly as it had been when she opened it, the gun, the bundles of cash, the stack of papers, not shifted even a fraction of an inch. She finished wiping the rest of the desk with hands that had become strangely steady again, swept her eyes across the room one last time, to make sure she had left no trace that she had seen what she shouldn't have seen, then picked up the bucket of water, walked out, and closed the door very softly behind her. From that moment on, Grace carried a secret inside her, and with it a quiet decision she would have to live with every day, that she would pretend not to know, that she would keep mopping floors and smiling and working, as though she had seen nothing, as though this house were merely cold and not deadly, and she told herself that as long as she didn't ask, didn't look, didn't know too much, perhaps she would be safe, perhaps they would leave her alone. But even as she tried to comfort herself that way, walking down the gray hallway with the bucket in her hand, a chill still clung to her spine, the feeling of someone who had just realized she had gone too deep into a place, where the way out was no longer as easy as the way in, and that the silence she had just chosen might be the thing that protected her, or it might be the thing that one day would make her pay. The visitor arrived in the late afternoon, and Grace knew at once that something was different, because the entire house shifted into a state of tension she had never seen before. The men on guard stood straighter, Frank moved faster with a face even more severe than usual, and someone ordered her to withdraw into the kitchen and stay there until she was called. But the kitchen had a small opening that looked out onto the main hallway, and Grace, though she had told herself again and again to play deaf and blind in this house, still couldn't stop herself from glancing out when she heard unfamiliar footsteps echo across the marble floor. The man who entered looked to be in his 60s, his silver hair combed smoothly back, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, and he moved with the unhurried ease of someone accustomed to having the whole world step aside for him. But it was precisely that calmness that made a chill crawl up Grace's neck. because it wasn't the calm of a decent man. It was the calm of a predator who knew exactly where he stood in the food chain. He was Victor Ashford, though Grace didn't know his name then. She only sensed, from the way Frank bowed his head in greeting, and from the way Michael himself came out to receive him, that this was a man whose weight was equal to, perhaps even more dangerous than, the man she worked for. The two men greeted each other with words so polite they felt cold, with no warm handshake, no sincere smile, only two forces measuring each other beneath a shell of civility. And they went into the large living room, where Grace could no longer see them, but could still hear snatches through the distance if she held her breath and stood very close to the opening. Victor spoke in a deep voice, smooth as velvet, the kind of voice that made even the most dangerous words sound gentle as an invitation, and what Grace heard made the hair on the back of her neck rise. He spoke of the two families, of changing times, and of wise men needing to know how to join together before someone else swallowed them whole, of how an alliance between the two houses would make no one dare touch either of them again. And then he mentioned his daughter, Isabel, in the voice of a man placing a valuable chess piece on the board, suggesting that a marriage between Isabel and Michael would be the perfect way to bind two empires into one unshakable force. Grace stood motionless beside the opening, her heart pounding, and though she told herself this had nothing to do with her, though she knew she was only the cleaner and had no right to care about the schemes of people like these, she still felt something unpleasant rise inside her chest when she heard the way they discussed marriage, as if they were discussing a business deal, without a single word about affection, only power and territory and survival. Michael answered in that low, even voice Grace had come to know too well, neither warm nor openly refusing, only cold and cautious, saying that he would consider it, that decisions like this shouldn't be made in haste. And Grace recognized that even in that restraint there was weight, as though both men knew this wasn't merely a proposal, but a move in a far larger game whose full shape she couldn't see. Something in the air of the house that afternoon unsettled Grace in the way her survival instincts had learned to trust, a feeling that beneath Victor Ashford's smooth words lay something sharp, that the silver-haired man had not come here out of goodwill, but for a purpose he had not yet spoken aloud, and that Michael, no matter how intelligent and watchful he was standing near a trap that she, the small outsider, was somehow the one who sensed most clearly. When Victor left, he paused in the foyer, and in a moment Grace wished had never happened. His eyes slid toward the kitchen opening and caught her standing there, and, though she quickly lowered her head and turned away, she still saw in those cold eyes a flash of something, not a man's interest in a young woman, but the sharp look of someone who always remembered every detail, every unfamiliar face, everything that might become useful later. That night, when Grace left and walked along the cold street toward the bus stop, she had the prickling feeling at the back of her neck that someone was watching her, and when she looked back, she saw only a dark car parked across the street, its engines still murmuring softly and both headlights dead, sitting still in the darkness like an animal lying in wait. And though she told herself she was only imagining things, that it was just an ordinary parked car, she still walked faster toward the lights, not knowing that from this day on, she was no longer invisible, but had become a name someone had quietly written down. A few days after Victor's visit, his daughter came, and this time no one told Grace to retreat to the kitchen, so she had the chance to see with her own eyes the woman people were discussing as a match for Michael. Isabel Ashford entered the house as though it already belonged to her, a woman in her early 30s with a perfectly straight, confident stride, dark hair falling loose in flawless waves, an expensive outfit fitting her with elegant precision, and everything about her, from the sharp rhythm of her high heels, striking the marble floor to the way she removed her thin leather gloves, radiated the presence of someone born into power, and never once forced to question her place in the world. Her gaze swept across the living room with the assessing look of someone measuring the value of everything, and when that gaze stopped on Grace, who was kneeling near the fireplace, wiping the baseboard in her mother's oversized uniform, Isabel looked at her for exactly 1 second, one cold and contemptuous second, then turned away as if she had just seen a stain on the carpet rather than a human being. She said nothing to Grace, and that silence was sharper than any insult could have been, because it made it clear that in Isabel Ashford's world, A girl who scrubbed floors wasn't even worth wasting a sentence on. Grace lowered her head and kept wiping, trying to make herself as small as possible, but she couldn't help feeling the cruel contrast between the two of them. On one side, a woman wearing an entire fortune on her body, cherished and protected, accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed, and on the other Grace herself, her hands cracked from cleaning water, her sweater frayed at the elbows, a few loose coins in her pocket, and a burden on her shoulders that the other woman probably couldn't even imagine. Isabel stepped forward to meet Michael, and the way she spoke to him was as calculated as her father had been, smooth, confident, threading every sentence with implications about a shared future, about what the two families could accomplish together, and she stood closer to him than necessary, leaning in with an intimacy carefully staged. But Grace, even with only stolen glances from the corner of the room, realized Michael did not return that intimacy at all. He kept his distance both in body and in voice, answering her with the same cautious coldness he had given her father, not rude, but with absolutely no warmth either. And there was one moment when Isabel placed her hand on his arm, and Grace saw him shift slightly away, a movement so small that perhaps only someone watching closely would have noticed, but enough to say that even if the whole world was arranging these two together, the man's heart was not there. What surprised Grace, and made her look at Isabel a second time, was the fleeting thing she caught on the proud woman's face when Michael moved away. For only an instant before Isabel managed to hide it behind her familiar, composed smile, Grace saw in her eyes not the anger of a woman rejected, but something far more complicated, a passing weariness, a bitter resignation, as though Isabel herself was being pushed into this marriage no differently than a chess piece, and beneath that cold, arrogant shell there was a human being. The whole world had never bothered to ask what she truly wanted. That glimpse vanished as quickly as it had appeared, and Isabel once again became the icy woman of perfect self-control, but it was enough for Grace to understand that this woman's story was not as simple as it looked, that behind the contempt she threw toward Grace, there might be wounds she did not permit anyone to see. When Isabel was about to leave, she stopped right beside where Grace was working, looked down at her from above with sharp, cold eyes, and spoke to her for the first time, her voice gentle, but every word like a needle. Girls like you should remember your place. This house isn't meant for foolish dreams, and people who forget that usually don't come to a good end. Grace lifted her eyes to look at her, and in that moment she didn't bow her head, didn't answer back, only quietly met the other woman's gaze with a calm that made Isabel herself pause for a fraction of a second. Because in the eyes of that seemingly fragile cleaning girl, there was a silent strength that Isabel, with all her power and money, perhaps no longer had, the strength of someone who had nothing left to lose, and therefore nothing left to fear. Isabel turned on her heel and walked away, the sound of her high heels fading across the marble floor, leaving Grace with the strange feeling that the meeting had not simply been the contempt of someone above for someone below, but the first moment when two women from two separate worlds saw something in each other that neither one was willing to admit. It happened on a morning when Grace had no other choice. The neighbor who usually watched Tommy for her suddenly had something she had to do, and Grace couldn't leave the 9-year-old boy home alone, not with his fragile heart, not when one sudden spell of weakness could become a disaster. So she did the thing she knew was reckless. She brought him with her to work, telling him again and again that he had to sit quietly in a corner of the kitchen, couldn't run around, couldn't make noise, couldn't wander off, and Tommy had nodded obediently and promised with his wide, trusting eyes. But Tommy was a child, and children weren't made to sit still in cold rooms, so only a little while later, while Grace was busy cleaning in the next room, the boy slipped curiously out of the kitchen, his small feet stepping softly over the marble floor, his eyes wide as he looked around the enormous house, as though he had wandered into a castle from a fairy tale. And he wandered near the threshold of the study, adjacent to the kitchen, where Michael happened to be stepping out with a stack of papers in his hand. Before the guard at the hallway corner could gently lead him back, Tommy was already looking up at that frightening stranger with innocent curiosity and no trace of fear, asking in his clear, bright voice, "Who are you, mister? Your house is so huge." The whole corridor seemed to freeze. The guards nearby went rigid, caught between protective duty and the innocence of a child. No one dared breathe, because no one not once had ever dared approach Michael Caine with such carefree innocence. Grace, hearing her brother's voice, rushed out from the kitchen with her face white from terror. "Tommy," she whispered hoarsely, "come here to me." "I'm sorry, sir. He didn't mean it. I'll take him out right away." But just as she was about to pull him away, she stopped short, because Michael had lifted his head, and the expression on his face was not the anger everyone had been waiting for. He was looking at the boy. He was looking at that small, pale face, the lips faintly bluish, the way the boy's thin chest rose and fell a little faster than normal, the sign of a heart working harder than it was able to. And something in Michael's dark eyes changed, something cracked and opened, as though the sight of this boy had touched a deep place inside him that he had locked away and buried for years. For a long moment, Michael said nothing. He only looked at Tommy with an expression Grace had never seen on him before, not his constant coldness, but a faraway sorrow, deep and hollow, an old pain she had thought was asleep suddenly awakened. And she had the feeling that when he looked at Tommy, he wasn't truly seeing the boy in front of him, but someone else, a shadow from the past, something he had lost and could never find again. Then Tommy, utterly unaware of the silent storm he had just stirred, pointed at the stack of papers on the table and went on with the adorable seriousness of a child. "Do you work that much? Do you ever play? Grace says grown-ups have to play too, or they'll get sad." And that innocent sentence, spoken in the middle of a room full of men holding their breath, broke the tension in a way no one had expected. Michael looked at the boy a little longer. Then, to everyone's astonishment, something very faintly softened on his face, and he said in a low voice that this time held none of its familiar coldness, "You're right. Grown-ups often forget that." Tommy grinned, pleased to have been acknowledged by an adult. And Grace stood there with one hand around her brother's shoulder, completely unable to understand what had just happened, only sensing that she had just witnessed a moment that should never have taken place, a crack revealing something about this man that he kept hidden even from those closest to him. She hurriedly apologized again, promised she would never let it happen again, and led Tommy back to the kitchen. But when she glanced over her shoulder, she saw Michael still sitting there, his eyes following the boy until he disappeared completely. And on his face lingered the look of a man who had just been touched by the past in a sudden and painful way. What Grace didn't know, what it would take her a long time to understand, was why a strange little boy with a sick heart could soften the coldest man in Boston so deeply, and that the answer to it lay buried inside a loss Michael Caine had never told anyone about, a pain that had made him into the man he was today. Grace kept counting in her head 8 weeks. That was the length of time the doctor had said her mother would need to recover enough to return to work. 8 weeks, and then Grace would withdraw back into her old life, and this house would be nothing more than a strange memory. She told herself that almost every day, partly to reassure herself that she wouldn't have to remain in this dangerous place for too long, and partly because, for some reason she didn't want to admit, the thought of leaving made something inside her ache. But while she counted down those days, something strange was happening, slowly and almost unnoticed. The house was beginning to change. It began with music. One morning, when Grace thought she was alone, she softly hummed again while wiping down the staircase, and this time, instead of a man appearing to remind her of the rules, no one stopped her at all, and her small singing voice grew little by little, hesitant at first, then more certain, slipping through hallways that had once known nothing but silence. A few days later, she brought in a small old speaker, set it in the kitchen, and played cheerful melodies while she worked, and no one told her to turn it off, not even when Michael passed by and stopped for a moment at the threshold, listened, then quietly walked on without saying a word, and Grace realized that this time, his silence was not a prohibition but a kind of unspoken permission. Then came color. One day, Grace timidly asked whether she might try painting one small section of the blank wall in the corner of the dining room, only to see how a little warm color would look, and she had prepared herself to be refused. But Michael only looked at her for a while and gave a slight nod. And so the next day, a small patch of wall in the warm yellow of late afternoon sunlight appeared among the cold gray spaces, a tiny but living spot of color like a seedling pushing up through a crack in stone. Grace didn't stop there. She brought in a few small green plants and placed them by the windows. She pulled the heavy, thick curtains aside so sunlight could pour into rooms that had spent years buried in shadow. She rearranged the pillows on the chairs, added a little color here, a little life there, and bit by bit, the house that had once resembled a sealed fortress began to breathe, began to warm, began to take on the shape of a place where people truly lived, not merely existed. The men on guard changed too, though they never said it aloud. Grace caught them lingering longer in the kitchen, where the smell of food remained, saw the corners of their mouths loosen slightly when her music played, saw something more human slowly reveal itself on faces that had once been hard as stone, as though they too were quietly enjoying the warmth she had brought and did not dare admit it. But not everyone looked at that change with gentle eyes. One afternoon, after Grace had gone home, Frank came to Michael in his study, his voice low and stern, unable to hide his worry. He said Michael had let this go too far, that he was allowing an outsider to change not only the house but Michael himself, and that was more dangerous than any gun pointed at him. Frank spoke in the voice of a man who had lived long enough in their world to understand its merciless rules. In our lives, emotion is a luxury that kills. Your enemies don't need to find a weakness in your body. They only need to find what you care about, and once you let yourself care about something, about someone, you've handed them the knife to cut your throat. He paused, looked straight at Michael, then went on in a quieter but heavier voice. I've followed you for many years. I've never seen you like this. And I'm afraid, not for myself but for you, because the day you begin to have something to lose is the day you become weak. And in this world, the weak don't live long. Michael did not answer at once. He stood by the window, looking out at the vase of fresh, vibrant flowers Grace had placed on the terrace, and for a long while he only stayed silent. Frank, receiving no reply, finally lowered his head and left, leaving his warning hanging in the air like an omen. Alone again, Michael continued looking at that small touch of life for a long time, and perhaps deep down he knew Frank was right. He knew that with every passing day, he was allowing that girl to move closer to a place no one should ever have been permitted to touch. He knew that the price of this weakness, if it ever had to be paid, would not be cheap. But even while he understood all of that, he still could not, or would not, give the order to remove the small touch of warmth quietly softening his cold house. The fragile warmth that had just begun to kindle inside the house did not last long before another shadow fell over it, and it began with something Grace knew absolutely nothing about. One evening, after she had gone home, Frank stepped into Michael's study with a face darker than usual, set a folder down on the desk, and said in a heavy voice that there had been a leak. A shipment at the harbor had been intercepted at exactly the right moment. A private meeting had been known to outsiders in advance. Details that only a very small number of people inside the organization were allowed to know had somehow reached the ears of their enemies, and that could mean only one thing. Someone in the house was selling them out. Michael sat in silence and listened, his fingers woven together, his face expressionless, but inside his head an entire machine was turning, sifting through every name, every face, every person who had been beside him long enough to reach that information. And Frank, as though he had read his thoughts, said the thing Michael knew he had been waiting a long time to say. There is only one new variable in this house, only one stranger, who appeared exactly when everything started leaking, and you don't need me to say her name. The name Grace, though it was not spoken aloud, hung between the two men, heavy and impossible to deny. Frank continued, his voice so coldly logical it was cruel. She appeared out of nowhere. She moves through the house under the excuse of cleaning. She has even been inside this study. And you've let emotion cloud your caution so badly that you can no longer see the most obvious thing of all, that this could have been the entire purpose behind placing her here from the beginning. A poor, pitiful girl with a tearful story is the most perfect cover your enemies could have imagined. Those words had weight, and Michael couldn't deny it, because everything Frank said fit into a cold logic without a gap, and in Michael's world, coincidence was a luxury no one was allowed to trust. One part of him, the part that had survived so many years precisely because of suspicion, wanted to believe Frank was right, wanted to rebuild the cold wall around himself, and deal with Grace the way he would deal with any other threat, decisively and without mercy. But another part, the part he could not understand and could not control, kept seeing the image of that girl kneeling as she wiped the floor, and softly sang. The image of her pushing a hot plate of food toward him with genuine gentleness, the image of the pale little boy standing in the middle of the living room with clear eyes, and that part whispered that something about this woman could not be false, that no one could act out such unguarded kindness so convincingly. Michael did not tell Frank what he was thinking. He only gave the order, coldly and calmly. Investigate, everyone, leave no one out, and keep it quiet. I don't want the traitor to know he's being watched. Frank nodded, satisfied that at least his boss had agreed to be cautious again. But what Frank did not know, what Michael kept to himself, was that very night he quietly assigned another task, not to Frank, but to a man he trusted absolutely, and that task had nothing to do with investigating the leak. He wanted to know everything about the boy, about Tommy, about his heart condition, about the surgery he needed, about the amount of money his family couldn't afford, about every detail of the hardship that girl was carrying. He did not explain the reason, not even to himself, only sat alone in the dark room after giving the instructions, staring into empty space, while a question rang through his mind, one he did not want to face. Why was he, a man who had taught himself not to care about anyone, putting effort into learning about the suffering of a cleaning girl and her little brother? He told himself it was only part of the investigation, that he needed to know whether her story was true, that this was caution, not concern. But even as he told himself that, some deep corner inside him knew it was a lie, knew that the knot in his chest, whenever he thought of that pale boy, had nothing to do with security or betrayal, but with something much older, much more painful, and far more private, something he had buried for so long that he had thought it was dead, only to discover it had merely been sleeping, waiting for a boy with a fragile heart to walk into his house and wake it. It happened late one evening, when Grace stayed longer than usual to finish the last of her work, and Michael, for a reason even he didn't want to examine, offered to walk her all the way to the gate instead of letting her go alone through the dark to the bus stop. They stepped out into the broad front courtyard beneath the dim yellow lights, the space silent except for the wind moving through the trees, and Grace was about to thank him when she saw Michael suddenly stop, his entire body tightening like a drawn bowstring, and in that split second, before she could understand what was happening, he had already turned and placed himself in front of her, just as a sharp explosion tore through the night. Everything after that happened so quickly Grace could only feel it, not think. Michael seized her arm, yanked her hard down behind the low stone wall bordering the courtyard, and she heard the next shots, the sound of bullets striking stone and spraying sparks just above her head, the crash of glass shattering somewhere, and the shouts of men rushing out from inside the house. She lay flat against the cold ground, her heart pounding wildly, her whole body trembling, and Michael shielded her with his body, one hand gripping the back of her neck to keep her head down, the other already holding the black gun she'd once seen in the drawer. And now, right before her eyes, that man was no longer the silent employer seated behind a desk, but something else entirely, cold, precise, deadly. He rose from cover for one perfectly calculated instant, fired back toward the darkness where muzzle flashes sparked, his voice ringing out with icy authority as he gave his men short, decisive orders, and Grace, crouched behind the stone wall, with her ears ringing from the gunfire, watched the whole world she'd been deliberately shutting her eyes to all this time lay itself bare before her in naked, brutal truth. The gunfight lasted only a few minutes, but to Grace it felt as long as a lifetime. Michael's men spread out to surround the grounds. The engine of a car roared to life and sped into the night as the attackers fled. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything sank into silence. A heavy silence broken only by ragged breathing and the sharp smell of gunpowder lingering in the cold air. Michael turned back to her at once, and for the first time since she'd known him, his face no longer held its usual cold composure. There was something frantic and fierce in his eyes as he bent down, both hands gripping her shoulders, searching her all over. "Are you hurt? Were you hit?" His voice was hoarse and urgent in a way Grace had never heard before. She shook her head, unable to speak, her whole body still shaking, and when she saw the blood spreading across his sleeve, only then did she realize that a bullet had grazed his arm, that this man had put his own body between her and death without hesitating for even a second. That realization lodged in her throat, and she reached out with a trembling hand to touch his wound. "You're hurt," she whispered, but Michael only shook his head, as though the wound on his arm was nothing compared with the terror he'd just endured when he thought she might have been shot. In that moment, in the courtyard still heavy with the smell of gunpowder, The two of them looked at each other, and something wordless passed between them, a truth neither of them could deny anymore. Grace knew now. She knew exactly what she'd stepped into. Knew that the suspicions she'd tried so hard to smother all this time were true, and even worse than she'd imagined. Knew that this man lived in a world of violence and death, a world where merely standing close was enough to get her killed. And by every ordinary measure, this should have been the moment when she ran, when she stood up and fled from this house and never came back. But as Michael helped her to her feet, as she looked into the eyes of the man who'd risked his life to protect her, she didn't feel fear overpower everything else the way she thought she would. Instead, amid the horror and shock, something else was growing inside her chest, a painful confusion, because she realized that the person truly terrifying her wasn't the men who had just fired from the darkness, but the undeniable feeling that she'd begun to care about this dangerous man, to care more than she dared admit, and that this, not the bullets, was the most dangerous thing for her now. Michael brought her back into the house, into a small, quiet room, and while one of his men brought a first aid kit to bandage the wound on his arm, Grace sat there with both hands still trembling, and at last, when only the two of them remained, she spoke, her voice hoarse but steady. "Who are you?" It was no longer the question of a naive girl, but the confrontation of someone who had just nearly died and was too tired of pretending, and she went on, "I'm not stupid. I saw the gun in the drawer a long time ago. I've seen the men standing guard, the locked rooms, the cameras, and now this. People just opened fire on us right outside your door, so please don't treat me like a child anymore. Tell me what I'm standing in the middle of." Michael was silent for a long time, his hand tightening around the edge of the table, and Grace thought he would retreat into his usual distant armor again, would tell her it was none of her business, but instead, he lifted his eyes to her, and in those dark eyes there was a weariness, a bare honesty she had never seen before, and he said softly, "You've already figured it out. My world isn't a place for people like you. It's built out of things you shouldn't know about, and every day you're here is another day you're standing close to something that can kill you, just like tonight." He did not give details, did not name names, did not confess outright, but the way he spoke was enough to confirm every worst thing Grace had suspected, and strangely, instead of making her run in fear, that honesty drew her closer to him, because for the first time he was not hiding behind a mask, for the first time he was letting her see the burden he carried. She stood up, stepped closer to him, and asked in a smaller, more trembling voice, "Then why did you save me? Why did you put your own body in front of a bullet for a cleaning woman like me?" Michael looked at her, and in that moment all the walls he had built over so many years seemed to shake. He stood and faced her, the distance between them narrowing until only a few inches remained, and he said, his voice rough, "I don't know. That's the problem. I've spent my whole life not caring about anyone, making sure there was nothing that could be used against me, and then you walked into this house with that ridiculous singing of yours and shattered all of it. And then, in the middle of that breathless tension, between the smell of gunpowder still clinging to their clothes and the panic that had not yet faded from either of them, the last distance between them disappeared, and they kissed, an unplanned kiss, fierce and desperate, carrying everything they had both held back for so many days, fear, longing, the loneliness of two people from two worlds that should never have touched each other. For one moment, just one brief moment, Grace felt the entire dangerous world outside fall away, leaving only warmth and closeness and the feeling that perhaps, only perhaps, even in all this darkness there was still room for something true and beautiful. But that moment shattered as suddenly as it had come. Michael was the one who pulled away first. He gently pushed her back, stepped away, and Grace saw his face close off right in front of her, the warmth from a moment before replaced by a painful coldness, as though he had just slammed shut a door he himself had only just opened. "No," he said, his voice hoarse and hardening. "This can't happen. I can't let it happen." Grace stood there, her lips still warm from him, her chest aching from the sudden rejection, and she asked, her voice breaking, "Why?" Michael turned away, unable to look at her, both hands clenched into fists. "Why? Because you just saw tonight what happens to things that get close to me. Those men were aiming for me, and you nearly died just because you were standing beside me. And if I let myself care about you, if I allow this to keep going, then you'll become their biggest target. They'll find you. They'll use you to bring me down. and I would rather push you away right now than watch you die because of me." He turned back to look at her one last time, and in his eyes Grace saw not coldness, but the pain of a man cutting away the only thing that made him feel alive. "Go home, Grace," he said quietly, "and don't make me regret letting you stay." Then he walked out of the room, leaving her standing alone in the silence, with a heart that had just been awakened only to be immediately left broken, unable to understand how something so beautiful could end in so much pain. The days that followed were the coldest days since Grace had first set foot in that house. Michael kept exactly to what he had said. He rebuilt the emotional barrier between them, but this time it was higher and thicker than before. He avoided her, no longer stopped at the threshold to listen to her sing, no longer looked at her with that complicated gaze she had begun to wait for, and when he had to speak to her about something, he used the cold, hollow voice of an employer speaking to hired help, nothing more and nothing less. Grace understood what he was doing, or rather, she thought she understood, and that misunderstanding made the pain cut even deeper, because she didn't know the truth, that he was pushing her away to protect her. She only saw a man who had kissed her in a moment of weakness, then regretted it at once, and now treated her as though she were a mistake that needed to be erased. She blamed herself for being foolish enough to let her heart stir for someone from a world so far beyond her own. She told herself she should have known a man like him could never truly care for a girl who cleaned floors. And every morning when she stepped into the house that had once begun to warm beneath her own hands, she now felt it turn stark and uninviting again, just as it had been in the beginning, and her heart turned heavy with it. At last, after many days of silently gnawing on her shame, Grace made a decision. She would quit. She told herself her mother was nearly recovered, that she could find another job, that no paycheck was worth enduring a coldness that wore away her heart, day after day like this. Though deep inside, she knew the real reason she wanted to leave wasn't pride, but that she did not have the strength to stand near a man who had made her hope, only to extinguish that hope so cruelly. She had already written her resignation in her head. She had prepared herself to say it at the end of that day, but fate did not give her time. Late that afternoon, while she was cleaning, her phone rang, and the name on the screen made her heart tighten. It was the neighbor watching Tommy. The woman's voice trembled with panic over the line. "Tommy's having an attack. He's turning blue and he can't breathe. The ambulance is on its way. Get to the hospital now." The world around Grace seemed to collapse in a single instant. The cleaning cloth fell from her hand, and she stood frozen, the phone pressed to her ear, unable to breathe, because this was the very thing she had feared every day, every hour, the vision she had tried to drive from her mind every night, and now it was truly happening. She burst into tears, unable to hold them back, her legs shaking so badly they almost gave way, and through her tears she stammered that she had to go now, that her brother was in danger, and then she ran, forgetting her coat, forgetting everything, with only one burning thought left in her mind. She had to get to him. Michael, who was in his study, heard the crying and the sound of panicked footsteps, and stepped into the hallway just in time to see Grace rushing toward the door, her face soaked with tears and white with terror. He stopped her, asked what had happened, and though he had remained cold and distant with her over the past few days, his voice now clearly betrayed a worry he couldn't hide. Grace, lost in panic, could barely form a sentence. "Tommy, my brother, his heart, the hospital, I have to go." And that alone was enough to change Michael's face completely. Without a second of hesitation, he took her by the arm. "My car. I'll take you, it's faster." And despite all the distance he had tried to create, despite the cold wall he had just built between them, he pulled her out to the car, ordered the driver to go as fast as possible, and all the way to the hospital, as Grace sat curled on the seat, trembling and sobbing, praying in despair for her little brother. She felt a warm hand take hers and hold it tightly. When she looked up through her tears, she saw Michael looking at her, and there was no coldness left in his eyes at all, only a deep fear and something else she had no time to name, something that made her feel, in the middle of the greatest terror of her life, that at least in this moment she did not have to bear it alone. While Grace sat beside Tommy's hospital bed through the long, endless hours of waiting, somewhere else in the city, inside a luxurious and cold study, Isabel Ashford was turning through a file she had quietly gathered, and what she discovered made her sharp eyes narrow. Isabel wasn't the kind of woman to walk into an arranged marriage without finding out everything connected to it for herself. And when she noticed the way Michael looked at that cleaning girl, the way he moved away from Isabel, yet risked his own life to shield someone who should have meant nothing at all, the instincts of a woman, accustomed to controlling every situation, told her that she had to investigate the girl. She had hired someone to dig through Grace Bennett's past, and at first what they found was only the dull, impoverished story she had expected. A girl working several jobs to support her family, a sick mother, an ill younger brother, nothing remarkable. But while digging through her own father's private intelligence network to see if Victor had somehow planted this girl in Michael's house, her investigator stumbled upon a different, heavily encrypted file. A file that had nothing to do with Grace Bennett, but everything to do with Isabel. It contained the truth about the death of her former husband, the man she had buried years before, the man whose death the police had recorded as an accident. Isabel's hand tightened around the file until her knuckles went white. The documents revealed that the accident was orchestrated, and the fingerprints on the operation led directly back to Victor Ashford's inner circle. Isabel sat motionless for a long time in the silent room, her mind spinning as the horrifying truth set in. The father she had always feared and respected had sacrificed his own daughter's happiness and orchestrated her husband's murder just to secure an alliance years ago. The cleaning girl was nothing but a distraction, a brief spark of jealousy. The real betrayal was in her own bloodline. She had not yet decided what she would do with what she knew. But one thing had become clear in Isabel Ashford's cold, sharp mind as she closed the file and looked out into the night beyond the window. Her father was using her again to swallow Michael Caine's empire, and she was no longer willing to be a pawn in a game played by the man who had destroyed her life. While the broken pieces of Grace's past were beginning to rise out of the darkness, the investigation Michael had ordered into the internal leak was also quietly closing around a truth no one had expected. The man he trusted with the surveillance had followed every lead, every call, every flow of money, and in the end, the name that surfaced was not Grace. The girl Frank had been so certain was the traitor. But someone who had been beside Michael for many years, someone he had never suspected, Danny Cross, the organization's treasurer, the man who held the numbers and financial secrets that only a few people inside the circle were allowed to know. The evidence showed that it was Danny who had been passing information about shipments, meetings, and plans to their enemies, and what sent a chill down Michael's spine wasn't only the betrayal, but the question of who was powerful enough to buy the loyalty of a man who had stood with him for so long, who could pay a price high enough, or threaten something terrible enough to break that loyalty. And when Michael followed that thread to its end, the answer made even him, a man who had thought nothing could surprise him anymore, go still. That thread led straight to Victor Ashford. The whole picture now appeared before Michael with cold clarity, and he realized that Victor's generous marriage proposal had never been a sincere invitation to alliance, but the opening move in an exquisitely crafted trap. Victor didn't want to join himself to Michael's empire. He wanted to swallow it whole. His plan was a masterpiece of malice. On one side, he would use the marriage to Isabel to bind Michael into a false alliance, lull his caution to sleep, and push his own people deeper into the inner circle of the Caine organization. On the other, he had quietly bought Danny Cross, slowly bleeding away Michael's secrets and resources, weakening him from within, so that when everything was ready, when Michael had been isolated and wounded enough, Victor would deliver the final blow and take everything Michael had built with his entire life. The attacks, the leaks, all of it had been pieces of the same conspiracy. A calculated campaign meant to wear him down little by little until he collapsed without ever understanding who had brought him down. Michael sat alone in the darkness of his study after receiving that news, and inside him rose an anger as cold as ice, the most dangerous kind of anger he possessed. Not exploding but freezing, not shouting but calculating. He thought of Danny, the man who had eaten at his table, the man he had trusted, now selling him out to the enemy. And he thought of Victor, the old fox disguised as a partner, who had stepped into Michael's own house, sat in Michael's own living room, smiled and spoken smooth words, while already carrying the plan to destroy him in his mind. But what made Michael's anger sharper than anything else, what changed it from a betrayal of his world into something personal and unforgivable, was when he put every piece together and realized That the night the attackers opened fire in the courtyard, the night Grace had nearly died, had also been part of this plot. That Victor and his men had been willing to let that innocent girl die as collateral damage in their game for power. And in that very moment, sitting alone in the dark with the brutal truth laid bare before him, Michael understood something about himself that he had spent days trying to deny. That what enraged him most was not the danger of losing his empire, but the thought that Grace could be harmed because of his war, and that realization, instead of making him want to push her farther away to protect her as he had tried to do, now lit within him a cold and fierce resolve that he would no longer run from what he felt, but would use every ounce of ruthlessness and strategy he possessed to protect her and destroy those who dared threaten her, and that Victor Ashford had made the deadliest mistake of his life when he turned the woman Michael Caine loved into a chess piece in his game. Victor Ashford was a patient predator, and he knew exactly that the weakness he needed to aim for wasn't Michael, who was far too hard and watchful, but the softest link in the chain, the poor girl with the sick little brother. He chose the perfect moment, when Tommy was still lying in the hospital after his crisis, when Grace was exhausted from worry and sleeplessness, when the new hospital bills had piled on top of debts that were already drowning her, and he sent someone to approach her right outside the hospital one evening, inviting her into a luxurious car where he was already waiting with the calm of a man who knew he held every card. Grace recognized at once the silver-haired man who had come to the mansion, and her whole body tightened with caution, but Victor began in that deep, warm, smooth voice of his, full of false gentleness, saying that he knew about Tommy, knew about the boy's illness, knew about the surgery she couldn't afford, and he said all of it with such sympathy that a chill crawled up Grace's neck, because she understood that a man like him never mentioned another person's pain unless he meant to use it as a weapon. And just as she feared, after that sweet prelude, Victor went straight to his purpose. He said he could take care of everything, the best surgery, the finest doctors, every bill wiped clean, Tommy's future secured, all in exchange for one very small task, something that, given her position inside that house, would be extremely easy. He wanted her to steal certain documents from Michael's study, specific papers he described in careful detail, and bring them out to his people, only once, and then every burden in her life would disappear. He presented it as though it were a favor he was granting her, as though he were saving her, and he ended with a threat wrapped in velvet, reminding her that Tommy didn't have much time left, that that small heart couldn't wait forever, and that this chance wouldn't come a second time. Grace sat there inside the cold luxury of that car, and she felt as though the ground beneath her feet had split wide open, because Victor had placed in her hands the cruelest choice a human being could face. On one side, the life of the little brother she loved more than herself, the child she'd sacrificed everything to care for, the child whose every difficult breath reminded her that time was running out, and on the other side, the betrayal of the man who'd risked his life to protect her, the man who, even after pushing her away, still made her heart ache whenever she thought of him, the man she knew she might drive to his death if she did what Victor asked. She thought of Tommy lying in his hospital bed with pale skin and a weak smile, and she thought of Michael standing between her and the bullets in the night, and those two images tore her heart in opposite directions until she felt she couldn't bear it. Victor watched her struggle with the cold eyes of a man who'd calculated all of this in advance, not pressing her, because he knew that silence and time would do their work, that a mother, a sister, faced with the life of a child she loved, would eventually do anything. Grace didn't answer right away. One part of her wanted to scream in his face that she'd never do it, that she'd rather die than betray anyone, but then Tommy's image rose before her again, and the words of defiance caught in her throat, because she knew she didn't have the right to trade her brother's life for her own nobility. She left the car that night without giving any definite answer, only saying that she needed time, and Victor smiled and nodded generously, because he knew that hesitation was already half a victory. And in the days that followed, Grace lived in a silent hell, carrying the weight of a choice with no way out, watching Michael from a distance with a broken heart, watching Tommy in the hospital with despair rising higher, and feeling herself trapped between the two things she loved most in the world, knowing that whichever one she chose, she'd lose a part of her soul, and that there was no road ahead that didn't pass through ruin, The night Grace decided to do what Victor asked was the longest night of her life. She had convinced herself that she had no other choice, that a sister's love for her little brother had to be placed above everything else. And with trembling hands and a heart heavy as lead, she slipped into Michael's study at the quietest hour, stood before the familiar desk, and looked at the drawer she knew held the documents Victor wanted. She stood there for a long time, her hand resting on the drawer pull, her whole body shaking, and inside her mind were the image of Tommy lying in his hospital bed, Victor's sweet, poisonous voice, and the enormous hospital bill hanging over her head like a blade. But just as she pulled the drawer open a little, another image rushed over her. The image of Michael using his own body to shield her from bullets in the night. The look in his eyes when he asked whether she was hurt with such real panic. And Grace realized that, even if she managed to save Tommy this way, she would kill a part of herself, would forever become the person who had betrayed the man who had trusted and protected her. And she would never again be able to look her brother in the eyes and say she had saved him through an honest act. Her hand stopped, tears rolled down her cheeks, and she pushed the drawer shut, let go, and in that moment she understood that she couldn't do this, that there were prices even love must not pay, that if she lost her own honesty, she would have nothing left to give Tommy except a life bought with guilt. But she also knew she couldn't stay silent, couldn't pretend the meeting with Victor had never happened, because doing so would leave danger waiting for Michael in the dark. And so Grace made the bravest and most painful decision of her life. She would tell Michael the whole truth, tell him about Victor, about the threat, about the fact that she had almost betrayed him, even knowing that doing so could cost her everything, her job, his trust, even the last chance to save Tommy. She went to Michael that very night, and standing before him with her face drenched in tears, she told him everything, her voice broken but hiding nothing. She told him that Victor had come to her, had promised to pay all of Tommy's hospital bills if she stole Michael's documents. She told him that she had weakened, that she had almost done it, that she had stood right here in this room with her hand on the drawer, and then she said, choking on the words, "I couldn't do it. Even if I lose Tommy, I couldn't betray you, and I came here to tell you the truth. Even if you send me away, even if you hate me, you deserve to know." She stood there waiting for his fury, waiting for contempt, waiting to be thrown out the door. But Michael did not get angry. He looked at her for a long time with an expression she couldn't read. Then he stepped closer, and what he said made Grace's whole world seem to stop turning. "Grace," he said softly, "Tommy's hospital bills have already been paid. All of them, weeks ago." She looked at him, not understanding, thinking she had misheard, and Michael continued, his voice low and gentle in a way she had never heard before. "The surgery, the hospital stay, every expense, I took care of it all a long time ago, right after the day I had someone look into the boy's condition. I just didn't tell you." Grace stood frozen, and as the meaning of those words slowly sank in, her knees weakened, because she realized that the brutal choice Victor had placed before her, the leverage he had used to force her into betrayal, had never truly existed. That while she had been writhing in the hell of being torn apart, believing Tommy's life depended on whether she sold off her soul, the man she had thought had pushed her away, out of coldness, had quietly saved her brother without asking for a word of thanks, without needing her to know, without expecting anything in return. She burst into sobs, not from sorrow but from something too enormous to name, an outpouring of gratitude and remorse and love, and through her tears she asked, "Why? Why did you do that and not tell me? Why did you let me suffer all that when you'd already saved him?" Michael looked at her, and for the first time the wall around him collapsed completely. He raised his hand and wiped the tears from her cheek, and said, "Because I didn't want you to feel indebted to me. I didn't want you to stay or care about me out of gratitude. I wanted to save the boy because it was the right thing to do, not because I wanted anything from you in return." And in that moment, standing in the room where she had nearly betrayed him, Grace saw the real Michael Caine. Not the cold, terrifying kingpin the whole city feared, but a lonely man who had learned to love in the only way he knew how, silently, quietly, without demanding anything. And she understood that no matter how far apart their worlds were, no matter how dangerous the road ahead might be, her heart belonged completely and forever to this man. Grace's confession, instead of becoming a disaster, turned out to give Michael exactly the weapon he needed. Now he didn't only know that Victor was setting a trap for him, He also held living proof that Victor had personally moved to coerce an innocent person. And with the cold, sharp mind of a man who had survived countless games of life and death, Michael began to plan how to turn the board against him. He understood that confronting Victor directly with violence alone was exactly what Victor expected, because the man had prepared for that kind of war, had planted people, had weakened Michael's organization from within through Danny. So Michael chose another path, one more subtle, more ruthless, striking at the very weaknesses Victor believed were his strengths. The first step was Danny Cross. Michael didn't have Danny seized at once, didn't reveal that he knew. Instead, he decided to turn the traitor into a reverse chess piece. He would let Danny keep believing he was safe, then quietly feed him false information, fabricated plans designed to lead Victor straight into the very trap Victor thought he was laying for Michael. He spent many nights in his study with his most trusted man, building every detail of the plan, calculating each move, preparing for a meeting which he would arrange himself in order to bring Victor and all his crimes into the light before eyes that even a powerful man like Victor would have to fear. But Michael knew that for the plan to succeed, he needed one link he wasn't yet certain of, and that was Isabel. Recognizing the dangerous knowledge she now possessed about her father's past betrayals, Michael quietly reached out to her, offering her the missing pieces of evidence she needed to finally expose Victor. This unspoken alliance fueled a cold fury within Isabel. For the first time in her life, the woman who had always obeyed her father was ready to turn her back on him completely. Michael, with his keen instincts, had successfully guided that wavering, knowing that pulling Isabel to his side would drive the deadliest blade straight into the very heart of Victor's plan, because no one understood Victor's secrets and weaknesses better than his own daughter. But before making any move, Michael did the most important thing to him. He took care of Grace's safety. He knew that when the confrontation began, Grace and Tommy would become the first targets Victor would strike at in revenge, and he couldn't allow that to happen. He arranged to move the two siblings to a discreet, safe place, a house closely guarded by men he trusted absolutely, and when he told Grace about it, she protested, not wanting to leave him, not wanting him to face the danger alone. But Michael took her hand, looked deep into her eyes, and said in a gentle but firm voice, "This time you have to trust me. I can't do what needs to be done if I'm afraid for you. Let me protect you and the boy. That's the only thing that will keep my head clear." Grace looked at him, and though her heart ached at the thought of being apart from him, she understood that this was how he loved her, and she nodded, asking him for only one thing: come back. No matter what happens, promise me you'll come back. Michael didn't promise, because he was a man who never promised what he wasn't sure he could keep, but he bent down and kissed her forehead, a tender kiss carrying everything he did not say aloud, then watched as she and Tommy were taken away into the night. Left alone in the house that now had no trace of her singing, Michael stood by the window and looked out into the darkness, and inside his chest, his cold anger had transformed into an iron resolve. He had spent his whole life having nothing to lose, and now, for the first time, he had something worth fighting for, and that was precisely what made him more dangerous than ever. The pieces had been placed where they needed to be. Danny was being led along without knowing it. Isabel was leaning closer to the truth. Grace was safe. And now all that remained was to wait for the moment when Michael Caine would strike the decisive blow. A blow he knew would either end the threat forever or drag everything down into the abyss with him. The confrontation took place at the harbor on a night thick with fog, where enormous warehouses stood looming like silent black shadows, and the dark water licked against the cold stone shore. Michael had arranged everything perfectly. Through the false information fed through Danny, he had lured Victor into believing this was his chance to deliver the final blow, that Michael would be at the harbor with a huge amount of goods and cash, not properly protected, a perfect prey. But what Victor didn't know was that this entire scene was a trap built for him, and that the people Michael had secretly invited to witness it were not enemy gunmen, but the most powerful eyes in the underworld, the Council of the Families, people even Victor had to fear, the ones who held the unwritten laws that everyone in their world had to obey. When Victor appeared with his men, led by Danny Cross with the confidence of a man who thought he was about to win, Michael stepped out of the darkness, calm and cold, and Victor smiled the smile of a fox who believed he had finally cornered his prey. But that smile vanished when Michael began to speak, not to Victor, but to the shadowed figures quietly emerging from the dark corners, the council members who had been standing there and watching from the beginning. Michael laid everything bare. He exposed Victor's plot to swallow his organization through betrayal and manipulation, instead of facing him by the rules. He presented proof that Victor had bought Danny, had ordered the bloody attacks, had been willing to sacrifice innocent people, and worst of all in the eyes of the council, had broken the most sacred rules that everyone in their world had sworn to respect. Victor, realizing the board had been turned against him, denied everything at once, calling it slander from a desperate man, and in that tense moment, when the words of two powerful men stood against each other, and the council still hesitated over whom to believe, the balance could have tipped either way. It was then that something no one expected happened. From the darkness, a woman's figure stepped forward, and when the dim light fell across her face, even Victor went still, because it was Isabel, his own daughter. She walked into the center of the circle, faced her father, and in a cold voice, trembling with both fury and pain, she confirmed that every word Michael had just spoken was true. Isabel brought out evidence only someone inside the family could have reached, documents, records, secrets she had quietly gathered, and she went even further, exposing the truth about the death of her former husband, revealing that her own father's hand had been involved in that tragedy years ago to serve his ambition, sacrificing his own daughter's life without a second thought. Isabel's testimony was the fatal blow, because nothing carried more weight than an accusation from the very blood of the guilty man, and Victor's face, for the first time in his life, twisted with collapse as he realized he had been betrayed by his own daughter, or rather that his daughter had chosen justice over his lies. In cornered desperation, Victor signaled Danny and his men to open fire, and the harbor sank into chaos, bullets tearing through the fog, shadows crashing into one another in the darkness. Michael had expected this. His men counterattacked immediately, and in the middle of the melee, Danny Cross, the traitor who had sold out the man who trusted him, tried to run but couldn't escape. He was brought down right there at the harbor, falling onto the cold stone, where he had believed he would witness victory, paying the price for his betrayal. The gunfight was brief but brutal, and not without losses, because Michael had never known victory to come easily. But when the fog began to lift and the gunfire fell silent, the board had been completely decided. Victor's men were restrained, and Victor himself was surrounded, with no path left to escape, standing alone before the council of the families, with all his sins dragged into the light. Those powerful people, the ones who had witnessed everything, now looked at Victor not with fear, but with the cold contempt reserved for a man who had betrayed every rule of his own world, and his fate was decided not by Michael's bullet, but by the council's judgment, a punishment even heavier than death for a man like Victor, the stripping away of every piece of power, honor, and status he had spent his entire life building. Michael stood in the harbor as the fog thinned, watching his enemy fall, but there was no joy of victory in him, only a deep exhaustion, and a single thought turned toward the woman waiting for him in safety, and he knew that this war, in the end, was not something he had fought to seize power, but to win the right to live a different life. But Victor Ashford was the kind of predator who would never fall alone, and even as everything collapsed around him, he still had one final card hidden up his sleeve, cruel and desperate. In the chaos at the harbor, before he was completely restrained, he had managed to give an order over the phone to a group of henchmen he had secretly sent out beforehand, men who were not present at the confrontation because they had been dispatched to the very place where Grace was being kept safe. Victor had anticipated the possibility of failure, and he had prepared for it by aiming at the one thing Michael was truly afraid of losing, and when he was cornered, he lifted his head, looked at Michael with a twisted smile full of resentment, and said that if he had to lose everything, then Michael would pay with the most precious thing he had. Michael's phone rang at that exact moment, and the cold voice on the other end told him that the safe house had been attacked, that the guards had been overwhelmed, and that Grace was in their hands. Michael's whole world seemed to freeze. The man who had just brought down the greatest enemy of his life, who had just stood at the height of victory, suddenly felt the ground collapse beneath his feet, because he understood that all the power, all the strategy, everything he had won that night meant nothing if something happened to Grace. He left immediately, and all the way to the place where they were holding her. His heart, long hardened by the years, beat wildly with a fear he had never known before, the fear of a man who could lose the only thing that made his life worth living. When Michael arrived at the place, an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city, he saw Grace tied up, her face pale but her eyes still bright with defiance, and the kidnappers, Victor's last remaining men, delivered their demand. They wanted Michael to surrender everything: control of the harbor, his assets, the empire he had built with his entire life, in exchange for the girl's life. That was the moment Michael Caine's entire journey converged, the moment when the man he had once been, and the man he had become, stood face to face. Years before, perhaps he would have hesitated, perhaps he would have calculated, weighing power against one human life, because all his life he had been taught that the empire was everything, that emotion was a fatal weakness, just as Frank had always warned. But the man standing in that cold warehouse that night was no longer the man he used to be. He looked at Grace, looked at the woman who had walked into his dead house with a song, and revived something in him he had believed had died forever, and he didn't hesitate for even a second. "Fine," he said, his voice low and resolute. "You want everything. I'll give you everything. The empire, the harbor, all of it, but release her first." Grace looked at him through her tears, shaking her head, begging him not to do it, not to throw everything away for her. But Michael only looked at her with a calm tenderness, and in his eyes she read a truth that made her heart break open, that to him, she was worth more than everything he had ever owned. He set down his weapon, stepped forward, placing himself in danger to trade for her safety, ready to give away everything his world considered most important. And that very act, that calculated yet sincere surrender, proved to everyone, and to Michael himself, that he had finally chosen a human being over power, love over empire. But Michael had never been naive, and even in that moment of surrender, he had not come alone. Just as the kidnappers dropped their guard because they thought they had won, Michael's men, who had silently surrounded the warehouse beforehand, burst in from every direction. And in the brief chaos that followed, Michael lunged forward to pull Grace securely behind a stack of heavy crates, ensuring she was completely protected from any stray bullets. And when the shooting fell silent, Victor's last men had been taken down, while Michael was holding Grace tightly in his arms, both of them trembling but alive, whole and still together. He untied her with shaking hands, pressed his forehead to hers, and in that moment, inside the cold warehouse still heavy with the smell of gunpowder, no words needed to be spoken, because his actions that night had said everything his heart had been carrying, that he had been ready to trade his whole world just to keep her in his life, and that from this moment on, nothing, not power, not enemies, not even his dark past, could separate them anymore. In the weeks after the night at the harbor, Boston's underworld witnessed a quiet but profound rearrangement of order. Victor Ashford, once one of its most feared powers, had collapsed completely, not in a deafening explosion, but in the slow and total stripping away of everything he had ever possessed. The Council of the Families, after witnessing him break the most sacred rules and hearing his own daughter accuse him, handed down a cold judgment, taking from him all power, territory and alliances, leaving behind an old, lonely man with nothing but the shadow of himself. A fate that, for someone who had spent his entire life accumulating power, was more bitter than death. Danny Cross. The traitor, paid for his deception according to the merciless hidden laws of that world, a punishment no one needed to name for everyone to understand, because among people like them, betrayal of trust was a sin that was never forgiven. But the most important thing was not the downfall of the wicked, but the change taking place within Michael Caine himself. Standing at the height of power after removing every enemy, he could easily have continued down the old path, expanded his empire, ruled through fear as he had done for so many years. But he didn't. The night he was willing to trade everything to save Grace had shown him clearly what he had been running from for so long, that the cold empire he had built had never truly made him live, but only allowed him to exist, lonely and hollow, and that the only things that gave meaning to his life were the simplest things of all: a song, a hot meal, a hand holding his in the darkness. And so Michael began a journey more difficult than any war he had ever fought, the journey of leaving the underworld behind. He began turning the Caine organization's operations into legitimate businesses, honest harbor work, transparent investments, removing one strand at a time from the dark web he had woven over so many years. It wasn't an easy or swift process, not some miracle that turned a ruthless man into an honest one overnight. There were ties that couldn't be cut in a single morning, people in that world who didn't want to leave him in peace, nights when he still stayed awake under the weight of everything he had done. The names, the faces, the sins no amount of change could ever erase. Michael understood that he would always carry the scars of the man he had once been, that the past wasn't something he could deny or forget, but something he could only face and atone for day by day through better choices. And it was that honesty, that admission that change was a long and difficult road rather than a magical moment, that made his redemption feel believable and precious. Frank, the right-hand man who had once warned him about the danger of emotion, now stood beside him on this new journey. And though he still kept his old skepticism, there was something different in the way he looked at his boss now. Perhaps respect for a man who dared to do the hardest thing of all, to change himself. While Michael slowly freed himself from the darkness, Grace's family also began to come back to life. Tommy finally underwent the heart surgery, and after the long, tense hours of waiting outside the operating room, when the doctor came out with a smile and told them the operation had been successful, Grace collapsed into Michael's arms and sobbed, tears of a happiness she hadn't dared dream of for so many months. The boy gradually recovered, the pale cheeks of before slowly taking on color again, and for the first time in a long while, his childish laughter rang out without being followed by difficult breaths. Rosa, Grace's mother, also recovered from the accident, and when she learned the whole story, when she learned that the man whose house she had quietly cleaned had saved her entire family, she took Michael's hand with tear-filled eyes, unable to speak, and in that tightening of her hand was all the gratitude of a mother. The house on Beacon Hill, once a cold fortress of power and fear, now truly began to become a home, and Michael Caine, the man the entire city had once feared, was learning from the beginning how to live like an ordinary human being, slowly, clumsily, but sincerely, and he realized that it was the bravest thing he had ever done in his life. 6 months later, the house on Beacon Hill had become a place no one who knew it, in the old days, would have been able to recognize. The walls that had once worn a cold gray now carried gentle, warm colors. Morning sunlight poured through windows, no longer sealed behind thick curtains. Lush green plants stood in corners throughout the rooms, and most important of all, the house was now filled with sound, footsteps, conversation, Tommy's laughter as he ran through the hallways with a healed and healthy heart, and above all, singing, Grace's soft voice rising from the kitchen every morning, the voice that had once stunned an entire house full of hardened men, now the most familiar and beloved sound in this home. Where there had once been only the silence of fear, there was now life overflowing, and the man who had once sat alone in the dark now often stopped at the kitchen threshold just to quietly listen to her sing, with a gentle smile that no one would have believed he was capable of years before. Grace, with Michael's encouragement and support, had opened a small diner of her own, a warm place that served food cooked with her whole heart, exactly like the simple dream she had always carried. And that little diner quickly became a beloved place in the neighborhood, not because it was fancy, but because of the warmth people felt the moment they walked through the door, the warmth that was Grace herself. Michael insisted that the diner had to belong completely to her, carry her name, and be the result of her own effort, because he understood that what she needed was not charity, but the chance to shine through her own talent and strength. Rosa was healthy now, often coming to the diner to help her daughter, and looking at her whole family with eyes full of happiness, while Isabel, the woman who had once been a rival, after bravely turning her back on her father's dark past to choose the truth, had found her own path to begin again. And between her and Grace, two women who had once stood on opposite shores, a quiet understanding had grown, the respect of people who had walked through storms together. And from this story, there are things worth pausing to think about, because the heart of everything that happened was not in bullets or power or schemes hidden in the dark, but in one simple and profound truth, that a person's dignity is not measured by the wealth they own or the position they hold in society, but by the kindness they carry in their heart and the way they treat others. Grace entered that house as only a poor girl hired to clean, looked down on by the world, treated as invisible, and yet it was her sincere kindness, her courage that never disappeared before hardship, Her ability to give love even when she herself had almost nothing, that did what no power could do. It revived a heart believed to be dead, and lit up an entire life buried in darkness. The story reminds us that every person we meet along the road of life, whether a server, a cleaner, or anyone doing the quiet work society so often forgets, carries within them an entire world, dreams, pain, and dignity worthy of respect, and that the way we treat people who can offer us no benefit is what truly reveals who we are. The story also teaches us that no matter how deeply people have lost their way, they always have the ability to choose change, that no one is imprisoned forever by their past if they're brave enough to face it and atone for it, and that sometimes the strongest act is not conquering or ruling, but letting go, daring to soften, choosing love over fear. Kindness is not weakness as many people mistakenly believe, but a quiet strength that can move even the things that seem impossible to move, and respect for the dignity of every human being is the foundation of a life worth living. If this story has touched your heart in some way, please subscribe to our channel, like and share this video so you can listen to more meaningful and compelling stories every day. We would truly love to know how you feel about this story, whether it reminded you of something in your own life, whether you've ever met someone like Grace, someone who brings light to others through simple kindness, or whether you've ever witnessed a miraculous change in a person because of love and compassion. Please leave a comment and share what you feel from deep within your heart, because we truly want to hear your stories and thoughts, and perhaps your own words will become encouragement and light for someone else who needs them. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story all the way to the very last moment, and we also wish everyone watching this video good health, joy in daily life, and a peaceful, serene soul. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.